I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about the history of psychiatric genetics. In this short seminar, all I can really expect to do is to provide a brief introduction and a few highlights. I've decided to focus on the earlier history of psychiatric genetics, as this is likely less familiar to most of you, and rather than only giving lots of dry facts and dates, to try to illustrate this with particular prominent individuals, to provide when I can photos of them, to let you see what their books or articles look like. I would say that the goal I've set myself is to show you bits and pieces of the rich history of our discipline of psychiatric genetics so that I might whet your appetite for further self-study. So let's get started in a really prequel stage. The modern discipline of psychiatric genetics, as we understand it, started very close to the time of psychiatry itself. That is somewhere in the couple of decades between 1780 and 1800. But we do have one giant figure, Robert Burton, who was writing in the early 17th century, in this case, at the date of 1621, a little more than a decade after the death of William Shakespeare. And he wrote what was a classic that has been read up until this century on depression. The title is The Anatomy of Melancholy. And I want to point to you to a small part where he describes the synopsis of his first partition. As you can see my pointer here, that he describes all the causes of melancholy, dividing them into supernatural or natural, and in secondary as primary. He describes about the stars and chiromancy, but here particularly he notes that old age is a risk factor for melancholia, temperament, and here we note parents, it being an hereditary disease. So we have an observation from decades and actually more than centuries before modern medicine developed and psychiatry developed, with the understanding, as people had observed, that one form of psychiatric illness, melancholia, clearly passed from parents to their children. This is a preprint of an article that is coming out of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and it reflects a rather detailed review of the prehistory of psychiatric genetics from these years of 1780 to 1910. And what I next want to do is just highlight this overview. As you can see from the abstract here, I reviewed 48 representative texts published during this time period. Nearly all of those textbooks had sections on the etiology of mental illness, or actually they more frequently called it insanity. And in that section, they almost always made some comments about the importance of genetics in the etiology of insanity. So here is a review of the main points of that review itself. First, since the beginning of psychiatry as a medical discipline, roughly around 1780, most expert authors who were textbook writers viewed heredity as among the strongest risk factors for insanity. Second, during this time period, most writers concluded that it was a predisposition to illness rather than the illness itself, which was transmitted in families. Third, and this is related to the concept of predisposition, they were well aware of the apparent probabilistic nature of the transmission of insanity. They noted that it often skipped generations with an affected parent or aunt or grandparent or aunt or uncle, but the parent is well and the child is affected, and also noted that it seemed to often impact only on a few of many individuals within the same sibship. Fourth, authors discussed at length the question of whether there was what they describe as homogeneity or heterogeneity of the familial transmission of the various forms of insanity. The general conclusion was that heterogeneous transmission was the rule. That is, that in the relatives of the insane patients, almost all who would have been hospitalized in asylums at this time, the clinicians who were writing this material viewed a wide variety of psychiatric and sometimes neurologic disorders. Homogeneous transmission, that is the idea of like begets like, was an exception. It's interesting that two kinds of syndromes are mentioned repeatedly across these textbooks as being homogeneously transmitted, as one is much of what we would call cyclic psychosis or manic depressive illness, and the other was suicide, with a number of authors noting suicides running in families with high levels of homogeneity. Fifth, many writers noted that odd and eccentric personality features were common in the relatives and especially parents of their insane patients. And this obviously is a prequel to later developments of schizophrenia spectrum conditions within our own time period. Finally, inheritance, as they used it and as Burton used it, was commonly understood more broadly than we would today. It includes prior environmental parental experiences. That is, the inheritance of acquired characteristics was accepted for most of the 19th century and even well into the early decades of the 20th century. But also some authors noted that parent-offspring transmission could arise from psychological effects of the behavior of the parents or intrauterine effects. Now, let me turn to reviewing a highlight of a series of important authors that we might wish to describe, and I want to begin with Prosper Lucas. Prosper Lucas was a French alienist and geneticist. He lived from 1808 to 1885. He wrote a major 2-volume monograph on genetics in 1847, as you can see. This philosophical and roughly physiological traits of natural heredity would be the translation. These are very long and extensive. It would have one of the great mid-19th century reviews of the field of genetics, and he reviewed them across medical, physical, that would be anthropometric traits, and psychiatric conditions. In addition, Prosper Lucas was in his day what we might call a statistical geneticist and developed a pre-Mendelian theory trying to explain the stochastic nature of inheritance. The importance of Prosper Lucas's work is best illustrated that in one of the great books in all of the history of science, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, he noted Prosper Lucas's book as, quote, the fullest and best on this subject. And in his later works, particularly on variations in plants and animals, Darwin frequently cited Lucas's work more than a dozen times in that book itself. Now let's skip a number of generations to the figure of Jenny Koller, the most prominent woman who contributed to this literature in the 19th century. A bit of background is in order. Throughout the entire 19th century, virtually all observations in psychiatric genetics were uncontrolled. The vast majority of statistics that were reported is a very simple one. That is the proportion of hospitalized psychiatric patients who were hereditarily burdened, and by which they mean has some well-documented history of psychiatric illness or occasionally neurologic illnesses in their relatives. These percentages varied very widely from 4 or 5% to 80%, and that's partly because what disorders they considered to constitute a hereditary burden was quite variable, and which relatives they counted was also quite variable. But they had never used controls. The first study to do that was done by Jenny Koller in 1895. Here's a picture of what Dr. Koller looked like. She was encouraged by her mother to consider medicine. She met with one of the few physicians in Switzerland at the time. She completed medical school there, but she was unable to get what would be the equivalent of an internship, as they were not offered for women in Switzerland, and so went to Paris, France for her training. Here is what her article looks like. This would be a translation. She was at that point working in Zurich. I'll give a brief biography in a minute. The title is Contribution of Heredity Statistics of the Mentally Ill in the Canton of Zurich. Comparison of the mentally ill with the hereditary burden on healthy people due to mental disorders and such like. We can see that people wrote longer titles in those days for articles than we do today. And this was a relatively prominent journal based in Berlin, actually, even though she was Swiss. We published in Neuropsychiatric Genetics earlier this year, Astrid Klee, who's a professional German translator, and I, a detailed review of this article. And in the appendix, we present an entire translation into English. And I want to just briefly summarize for you here, just picking up on the abstract. The first such study in the history of psychiatric genetics was published in 1895. That was the doctoral dissertation of a Swiss physician, Jenny Koller. She was working under August Forel at the Berklossi Hospital in Zurich, Switzerland, a hospital very famous in the history of psychiatry. And Forel was succeeded by Eugen Bleuler, who we will meet later. She obtained histories of a range of mental and neurologic disorders in the parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and siblings of 370 hospitalized psychiatric patients and 370 controls who were not hospitalized. Interestingly, the rates of hereditary burden were only modestly higher in cases than controls. There was a great deal of surprise at the high level of mental illness occurring in the relatives of unaffected control subjects. However, Koller followed up trying to address two quite important questions. First, she examined which individual syndromes were actually more common in the relatives of the psychiatric patients and the controls, and she found only two categories, what we roughly translate as major mental illnesses and roughly translate as eccentricities, that is, abnormal behaviors. But she also considered syndromes of apoplexy, that is, stroke, nervous disorders, which included such things as headaches and probably some other neurologic disorders, as well as anxiety and dementia. And those three were not more common in the relatives of the psychiatric patients than the controls. Furthermore, the rates of mental illness and eccentricities were much more strongly elevated in the first-degree relatives of parents, largely children, largely parents and siblings, in cases versus controls. But the elevation for grandparents and aunts and uncles were much less. Again, this was one of the first systematic observations of the tendency of disorders to aggregate more in what we would now understand to be individuals more closely genetically related. In my view, Koller's study represents a major methodological advance in psychiatric genetics, helping to define which disorders co-aggregated with major mental illness. Let me now turn to what will be a darker part of the history of psychiatric genetics. This is the figure Ernst Rudin. I will again give you a brief biography. Those of you who can see will notice that he had a little lapel pin in it with the swastika, and that will be part of our story. Well, Ernst Rudin was born in 1874, died in 1952. He was Swiss. He graduated from medical school in Zurich in 1898, and his first job was also at the Burgology Hospital after Jenny Koller to assistant Eugen Bleuler. He then moved to the psychiatric clinic of the University of Munich in 1907, where he became an assistant to Emil Kreplin, under whom he completed his doctoral thesis. He was appointed a senior physician there in 1909, when Kreplin's lifelong dream, the establishment of the German Institute for Psychiatric Research, the first such multidisciplinary institute in the world for psychiatric illness, was established in Munich in 1917, Kreplin appointed Rudin as the head of the Department of Genealogic and Demographics Studies. Most of the leading members of the next generation of psychiatric geneticists, and that includes such figures as Elliot Slater, Eric Stromgren, and others from all across Europe, came to train in the department that Rudin had established in the 1920s and early 1930s. Rudin himself had two major works in psychiatric genetics, although his school, the program that he established, had many, many more works. The first was published in 1911 when he was 26, and this is the in this journal, and the title was Methods and Goals of Family Research in Psychiatry. It's an extensive article and outlines a methodologically sophisticated Mendelian-informed research program for psychiatric genetics, but you will notice in there a number of mentions about folk eugenic theories, about the folk and the wellness of the genes of the folk himself. His second major work was this, and along with his daughter, Edith Zerben Rudin, more than 2 decades ago, I published in Neuropsychiatric Genetics a summary and abstract of this. The title would be Studies of the Inheritance and Origin of Mental Illness to the Problem of the Inheritance and Primary Origin of Dementia Precox. This was the first large-scale systematic family study ever done of a psychiatric disorder. It included using these newly developed methods of Weinberg to age correct the sample and to use a probandwise correction method to get the correct results. The morbid risk that he calculated for narrowly and broadly defined schizophrenia in the sample was 5.4 and 7.7%. Those results are quite similar to modern findings. The study that I did in Roscommon early in my career found a rate of 6.6%, so very much in the range that Ernst Rudin found. He also found other psychoses were common, with a morbid risk of 5.1%, lower rates in half siblings. He noted the risk of schizophrenia was significantly increased in parental diagnoses of alcoholism, a history of schizophrenia in second or third degree relatives, and by parental diagnoses of other psychoses. Overall, Rudin found a familiar relationship between schizophrenia and other psychoses, a substantially lower risk of schizophrenia in parents versus siblings, and a segregation pattern of schizophrenia that did not conform with simple Mendelian disorders. Importantly to note, this was not a case control family study as we might do now. Actually, the purpose of this study was to see whether segregation patterns consistent with simple Mendelian transmission could be found. Rudin did note in this monograph that if there were 2 recessive genes, those 0.25 squared would equal a recurrence rate of 0.0625. He said that might be consistent with the model. Now, we need to talk about another key feature of Rudin's career. Rudin, as a teenager, developed a strong interest in racial hygiene and was in 1905 among the founders of the German Society for Racial Hygiene. After the rise of the National Socialists, that is the Nazis in Germany, in 1933, as director of the German Institute for Psychiatric Research, he had taken over the position from Kreplin after his death. Rudin collaborated extensively with the Nazi government, praised their racial policies, and received substantial funding both from them and later on from the SS. From 1933 onward, he played a major role in the development of the Nazi program of involuntary sterilization of the medically and psychiatrically ill. It is generally agreed that he was not actively involved in the Nazi T4 program, which was the systematic killing of the mentally ill and mentally handicapped that began in 1939, but the historical documents are quite convincing that he was aware of these efforts, knew of colleagues who were working in them, and he certainly made no attempt to stop or to publicize them. Furthermore, as documented in high-quality historical resources that have only been recently available in English, I would particularly recommend this book by Dr. Weiss, The Nazi Symbiosis, Human Genetics and Politics in the Third Reich. It's quite clear that Rudin played an important role in the scientific legitimization of Nazi racial policies, both within Germany and internationally. And we know historically, of course, that the acceptance of these policies laid the groundwork for the future horrors of the Holocaust. In light of his activities from 1933 onward, there is a range of opinions in our field about how Rudin's substantial scientific contributions to the history of psychiatric genetics should be treated. Some have argued that any discussion of his work is inherently immoral, as it inevitably rehabilitates him and dishonors the memory of those his suffering has contributed to. And I respect that tradition personally, although I don't agree with it. Others have argued that his work can and should be studied for two important and complementary reasons. One is he has played an important role in the history of our psychiatric genetics, but second, as a case study of the potential tragic effects of the misuse of our science. Let me then go on and conclude with this figure, Eugen Bleuler. He's probably the best known of all the people that I've spoken about here. This is a lovely photo of him as a young man. Bleuler is most famous for introducing the term schizophrenia to the world in a lecture in Berlin on 24 April 1908. He revised and expanded his schizophrenia concept in his seminal study of 1911. This is his great monograph, Dementia Praecox, a Group of Schizophrenias, and was unfortunately only translated to English in 1950. But in 1917, that is only a few years after the monograph published by Ernst Rudin, Bleuler wrote a very thoughtful critique of Rudin's family study of dementia praecox, and it's here that I want to add. This is the German version of this. And this has now been published in Schizophrenia Bulletin, which represents a detailed review of Bleuler's comment on Rudin. And like the other works that I've been doing here in the appendix, along with Astrid Klee, we publish a full English translation of Bleuler's comments. I want to review here the 4 key points made by Bleuler, again, working at a time when very, very different from our own. First, Bleuler argued that understanding the transmission patterns of schizophrenia in families requires definitive knowledge of the boundaries of the phenotype, and he argues that those remain unknown. Bleuler strongly suggests that Rudin's choice, which was Kreplin's concept of dementia praecox, was far too narrow. As we know, Bleuler was interested in such broader concepts as latent schizophrenia. What Bleuler argued was that clarifying the genetics of schizophrenia is inextricably bound up with the problem of defining the phenotype. You can't do one without the other. Second, Bleuler argued for the importance of Erbs-Schloss, which might be described literally as inherited schizoidia. And he wondered whether either his famous 4 A's or other, and I quote here from our translation, brain anatomical, chemical, or neurologic characteristics might underlie the genetic transmission of schizophrenia. This really is very similar to our concept of what might be an endophenotype. Third, Bleuler was quite interested in the nature of the onset of schizophrenia, suggesting that environmental adversities would often provoke, quote, latent illness to become manifest. It was important, he argued, to identify such risk factors and actually incorporate them into the genetic models, a relatively advanced concept we're still struggling with today. Fourth, although not optimistic that current knowledge would permit a resolution of the transmission models for schizophrenia, Bleuler finds single locus models for schizophrenia or dementia precox to be implausible, and at several points wonders whether polygenic models, he didn't give the number, it certainly was not conceived as the way Ronald Fisher would be, but a small number of genes might better apply. So this concludes the main part, and I want to summarize. My goal has been to introduce you to a few of the many important figures and topics in the history of psychiatric genetics. I want to leave you with one ethical and two overarching scientific themes of this history. The ethical part, our history illustrates the misuses to which the science of psychiatric and behavioral genetics can be put with tragic results, and therefore the need for our vigilance to reduce the chances of such developments in the future. From a more scientific perspective, I would suggest that the history of psychiatric genetics includes many themes, but two of which are overarching. The first is the close interrelationship between psychiatric diagnosis and genetics. How can you do the genetics of a disorder whose diagnostic boundaries are unclear? So inevitably, there is an intimate relationship with these two fields. That is, to get the genetics right, we need to get the diagnoses right. And the genetic strategy is one of the best ways to help us decide that, what a valid diagnosis is. So we are in this large, long, iterative process. And the second key issue that runs through much of the 19th and early 20th century is, do psychiatric disorders run true in families, or is there often heterogeneous transmission? And I would suggest to those of you acting and working in the field is that both of these issues are very extant, and we have solved neither of them. Thank you for your attention.